They handed me the pen with such casual confidence, I almost didn't question it. The silver ballpoint felt cold between my fingers as I stared down at the stack of papers spread across our mother's mahogany dining table. The same table where we'd carved our names as children, where Dad had taught us to play poker on rainy Sunday afternoons. "Just sign here," my brother Marcus murmured, his voice carrying that familiar tone of barely concealed impatience. His index finger tapped against a yellow sticky note marking the signature line, and I noticed how his eyes kept flicking toward our mother, who stood beside him with her arms crossed, her gaze deliberately avoiding mine. The room felt cold despite the August heat pressing against the windows. The air conditioning hummed its mechanical lullaby, but underneath that sound was something else, a tension so thick I could taste it on my tongue like copper pennies. Though I couldn't articulate it then, couldn't name the wrongness that crawled up my spine and settled in my chest like a stone, I knew something was off. But I signed anyway. The pen scratched against the paper with a sound that would later echo in my nightmares. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Sometimes when we're sitting in our deepest pain, it helps to know we're not alone in the darkness. It was 3 weeks later when I discovered what I had unknowingly signed away. 3 weeks of going about my normal life, teaching my 3rd grade class, watering my small garden, calling Mom every Tuesday like I always did, before the certified letter arrived at my apartment. The envelope was thick, official, and when I tore it open with shaking hands, the words swam before my eyes like black ants scattered across white paper. I had relinquished my share of our family's summer house, the house on Gulls Bay where Dad had taken us every July since I was 7 years old. The house where I had learned to dive off the weathered wooden dock, where I had nursed my first heartbreak at 16, while watching the waves crash against the rocks below. The house where I had whispered my deepest secrets to the salt-tinged wind, believing that within those cedar-shingled walls, we were a real family bound by something stronger than blood. Bound by love, by shared memories, by the promise Dad had made to all 3 of us that this place would always be ours. It wasn't just a property. It was the physical manifestation of every summer vacation, every Christmas morning when Dad would pull out the photo albums and point to pictures of us building sandcastles and catching fireflies. "This is where you kids belong," he used to say, his eyes crinkling at the corners the way they did when he was truly happy. "This house will keep our family together long after I'm gone." The betrayal didn't hit me all at once like a slap across the face. Instead, it seeped into my bones slowly, like ice water filling a cracked vessel. I read the legal document over and over, my teacher's brain trying to parse the dense language, searching for some loophole, some misunderstanding that would make this nightmare dissolve. But the words remained stubbornly clear. I had signed away my inheritance, my 1/3 share of the property that Dad had promised equally to Marcus, Sarah, and me in his will. I called Marcus first. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail, his voice cheerful and casual as he asked callers to leave a message. I hung up without speaking, my throat too tight to form words. I tried again an hour later, then again that evening. Each unanswered ring felt like another door slamming shut. My mother's number was next. She picked up on the second ring, her voice artificially bright. "Oh, honey, you got the paperwork then?" "Mom." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mom, what did I sign?" There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the tick of the grandfather clock in her hallway. The same clock that had marked the hours of my childhood. "It's complicated, sweetheart. Legal things always are. But it's done now, and honestly, it's probably for the best. You know how you've always been more focused on your teaching than on property management. But Dad wanted us all to have it equally. He said, your father said a lot of things." Her voice had shifted, become cooler, more distant. "Look, Emma. What's done is done. It's too late to change anything now. And frankly, I think you should let this go. Fighting about it will only tear the family apart more than it already has. Been the family. As if I were the one causing the division. As if I were the one who had orchestrated this betrayal while sitting around that dining room table, speaking in code and meaningful glances. I don't understand, I said. And I hated how small my voice sounded. How much like a lost child I must have seemed. Why didn't anyone explain what I was signing? Why did you all... Emma. The sharpness in her tone cut through my question like a blade. You're 32 years old. You should have read the documents before you signed them. No one forced you to do anything. The line went dead, leaving me holding the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone that sounded exactly like the flat line of everything I thought I knew about my family. I tried calling Sarah next, my older sister who had always been the mediator, the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over arguments and found compromises. Her phone went straight to voicemail, not even a ring, which meant she had either turned it off or blocked my number entirely. I left a message anyway, my voice cracking as I explained what had happened, asked her to call me back, begged her to help me understand. She never did. The silence that followed wasn't the absence of noise. It was an active, weaponized thing that wrapped around my life like kudzu, choking out everything familiar and safe. Family group chats continued without me. I could see the little notification that I was no longer a participant in Hartwell. Family updates. The thread where we had shared everything from grocery store encounters with old high school classmates to photos of our pets. Birthday notifications disappeared from my phone. The annual planning for Mom's surprise party, Dad's memorial service traditions, holiday schedules, all of it carried on in a parallel universe where I simply didn't exist. I started checking social media obsessively, scrolling through their posts like picking at a wound. There was Marcus posting photos from the summer house, his children building sandcastles on the beach where I had once done the same. Sarah shared a sunset view from the deck where Dad used to sit with his evening coffee, the caption reading, "Feeling grateful for family traditions." Mom commented with heart emojis and inside jokes that I was no longer privy to understanding. They had erased me so completely that sometimes I wondered if I had imagined my entire childhood. If those memories of family dinners and shared laughter were elaborate fantasies I had constructed to fill some deep emotional void. The worst part was the casual cruelty of it all. If they had screamed at me, if they had accused me of something, terrible if they had been angry, at least then I would have understood the punishment. But this cold dismissal, this surgical removal of my existence from their lives, felt like being slowly suffocated by indifference. I found myself revisiting old memories with the intensity of a detective examining crime scene evidence. The birthday, when I turned 25 and everyone seemed to have forgotten. Not just the party, but the day itself. We were so busy, Sarah had said when I mentioned it weeks later, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. The time I found out about Dad's cancer diagnosis not from family, but from Mrs. Henderson next door who assumed I already knew. "Oh, honey," she had said, her face crumpling with concern. "How are you holding up with everything your father's going through?" I had stood in her garden, surrounded by her prize-winning roses, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. When I confronted Mom about it later, she had looked genuinely surprised. "I thought Marcus told you," she said, but even then I had seen something flicker behind her eyes. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of calculated oversight that made my stomach clench. These weren't isolated incidents, I realized now. They were chapters in a story of slow disinheritance that had been written long before Dad died, long before any legal documents were signed. I had been gradually edited out of the narrative of our family, my role diminished from daughter and sister to distant relative, from equal inheritor to afterthought. The revelation was devastating and liberating in equal measure. For years, I had blamed myself for the distance I felt from them, assuming I was too sensitive, too demanding, too something. But now I could see the pattern clearly. The way important conversations happened without me. The way decisions were made and presented to me as fait accompli. The way my opinions were dismissed with patronizing smiles and changes of subject. I took a leave of absence from teaching, telling my principal I needed time to deal with a family crisis. It wasn't entirely a lie. I packed my car with clothes and books and drove away from the coastal town where I'd spent my entire life. Heading inland to a small city where no one knew my name or my story, I found a furnished apartment above a used bookstore, the kind of place where the floors creaked and the windows didn't quite close properly. But the rent was affordable, and the owner didn't ask too many questions. I took a job at a local community center, teaching adult literacy classes to people who had been overlooked by the education system. People who understood what it felt like to be invisible. The work was humble but meaningful. I helped Maria, a 50-year-old house cleaner, learn to read well enough to help her daughter with homework. I watched James, a veteran with shaking hands, slowly rebuild his confidence by mastering basic computer skills. In their struggles and triumphs, I found something I hadn't expected, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with family approval or inherited property. But every night, alone in my small apartment with its thin walls and secondhand furniture, the same question echoed through my mind. How could they do this to me? How could the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally orchestrate such a calculated betrayal? The question followed me into my dreams and greeted me each morning like an unwelcome houseguest who had overstayed their welcome. I began researching property law, not out of revenge, at least not initially, but as a form of intellectual self-defense. I needed to understand what they had taken from me, and whether I had ever truly had a right to it in the first place. I checked out books from the library, spent hours reading legal websites, tried to decode the language that had been used to trap me. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that I came across information about legal aid services. The website promised help for people who couldn't afford traditional legal representation, people who had been taken advantage of by those in positions of power. I stared at the intake form for weeks before finally filling it out, my cursor hovering over the submit button as shame and hope warred in my chest. The legal aid office was located in a converted house downtown, its rooms divided by temporary walls and filled with mismatched furniture. I sat in the waiting area beside a teenage mother trying to escape an abusive relationship and an elderly man fighting an eviction notice, feeling simultaneously humbled and embarrassed by my presence there. When my name was finally called, I followed a young woman with kind eyes and tired shoulders into a cramped office that smelled like instant coffee and determination. Attorney Patricia Wong listened to my story without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she asked to see the documents I had signed. I pulled them from my purse. I had been carrying them everywhere, like evidence of my own gullibility, and spread them across her desk. She studied the papers with the focused attention of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts, her brow furrowing as she traced lines of text with her finger. After what felt like an eternity, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This notarization is deeply flawed," she said, her voice careful and controlled. "There are significant discrepancies here that raise serious questions about the validity of this document." My heart began to beat faster, a drum rhythm of possibility that I tried to suppress. What kind of discrepancies? She pointed to several sections of the paperwork, explaining in terms I could understand how the timestamps didn't align, how certain required disclosures were missing, how my signature appeared different from others I had provided as samples. "It's possible," she said, "that this entire document could be challenged in court." The word court sent a chill through me. I had never been involved in any kind of legal proceeding, had never even gotten a speeding ticket. The idea of facing my family across a courtroom, of airing our private dysfunction in front of strangers, made my stomach churn with anxiety. "I need to think about this," I told her, and she nodded with understanding. "Take all the time you need," she said. "But don't take too long. There are statutes of limitations on these kinds of challenges." I walked out of that office into bright afternoon sunlight that hurt my eyes after the fluorescent gloom inside. For the first time in months, I felt something other than resignation flowing through my veins. It wasn't hope exactly. I wasn't ready for that kind of vulnerability yet. It was something smaller, but more sustainable. The possibility that I didn't have to accept what had been done to me as inevitable. That evening, I sat on my narrow apartment balcony with a cup of tea, growing cold in my hands, watching the sun disappear behind the buildings across the street. The city hummed with evening traffic and distant conversations, a symphony of other people's lives continuing their normal trajectories. I thought about Dad, about the way he used to say that integrity wasn't about being perfect. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. I called Attorney Wong the next morning before I could lose my nerve. "I want to proceed," I said, the words feeling strange and powerful in my mouth. "I want to challenge the document." What followed were months of quiet, methodical work. Patricia and I met weekly in her cramped office, building our case piece by piece like archaeologists reconstructing a broken artifact. We requested records, interviewed witnesses, traced the paper trail that led to that August afternoon when I had signed my inheritance away. The process was slower than I had expected, filled with legal procedures I didn't understand, and setbacks that felt like small defeats. There were days when I wondered if I was being vindictive, if I should have simply accepted my family's version of events and moved on with my life. But then I would remember Dad's voice, the way he had talked about the summer house as our legacy, our connection to each other and to something larger than ourselves. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. The silence my family had imposed on me became my sanctuary, a protective space where I could gather my strength without their judgment or interference. I continued teaching at the community center, found small pleasures in my students' progress, began to build a life that belonged entirely to me. Sometimes I would catch myself checking their social media, a habit I couldn't quite break despite knowing it only brought pain. The posts continued. Family gatherings I wasn't invited to, holidays celebrated without acknowledgement of my absence, photos from the summer house that showed how easily they had adapted to a world without me in it. But gradually, those images began to hurt less. The sting of exclusion faded into something more like pity for people who could discard a family member so casually, so completely. I began to understand that their ability to erase me said nothing about my worth and everything, about their capacity for love. 6 months after I first walked into the legal aid office, Patricia called with news that made my hands shake as I gripped the phone. "We have a court date," she said. "The judge has agreed to hear our case." The weeks leading up to the hearing passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Patricia coached me on what to expect, how to answer questions clearly and calmly, how to present myself with dignity, even if my family's attorneys tried to portray me as vengeful or greedy. We reviewed our evidence repeatedly, practiced my testimony, until the words felt worn smooth like stones in my mouth. I bought a navy blue suit for the occasion, something professional and serious that made me look older than my 33 years. Standing in the department store dressing room under harsh fluorescent lights, I barely recognized the woman looking back at me from the mirror. The frightened, confused person who had signed those papers seemed like a stranger now, someone I remembered with compassion, but no longer identified with completely. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed listening to the sounds of the city outside my window, sirens in the distance, the rumble of late-night delivery trucks, the occasional burst of laughter from people walking home from bars. I thought about all the nights I had lain awake as a child in the summer house, listening to the ocean waves crash against the rocks below, feeling safe and loved and certain that my family would always be there to catch me if I fell. I didn't feel safe anymore, but I felt something else. A quiet strength that came from knowing I had fought for myself, had refused to accept injustice, simply because it came wrapped in familiar faces and family bonds. The courthouse was an imposing brick building downtown. its steps worn smooth by decades of people seeking justice or fleeing from it. I arrived early, sitting on a bench in the corridor outside the assigned courtroom, watching lawyers in expensive suits hurry past with briefcases and important expressions. When I saw them arrive, my heart clenched in my chest like a fist. Marcus walked in first, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. Sarah followed, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her face composed in an expression of patient suffering. Mom came last, leaning slightly on a walking cane I had never seen before, playing the role of fragile elderly woman with Academy Award-worthy precision. They didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. It was as if I were invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of their carefully constructed narrative. Their attorney, a tall man with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from winning most of your cases, shepherded them into the courtroom like a shepherd guiding valuable sheep. Patricia arrived just as they disappeared through the heavy wooden doors. She looked tired, but determined, carrying a worn leather briefcase that had seen better days, but had clearly served her well in many battles. "Are you ready?" she asked, her hand gentle on my shoulder. I nodded, though ready felt like an inadequate word for the storm of emotions churning in my chest. I was terrified, and angry, and hopeful, and heartbroken all at once, a cocktail of feelings that threatened to overwhelm me if I examined them too closely. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, more like a conference room than the grand judicial chambers I had seen in movies. The judge was a middle-aged black woman with intelligent eyes and an expression that suggested she had heard every excuse and sob story imaginable. She looked up as we entered, her gaze taking in both sides with the neutral assessment of someone accustomed to weighing competing versions of truth. What followed was several hours of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal arguments that felt simultaneously momentous and mundane. Patricia presented our case methodically, walking the judge through the discrepancies in the notarization, the missing disclosures, the suspicious circumstances surrounding the signing. When it was my turn to testify, my voice shook at first, but I found my footing as I told my story. I explained how I had been presented with the documents, how the signing had been rushed and casual, how no one had explained what I was actually agreeing to. I spoke about my father's wishes, his explicit promise that the summer house would belong equally to all three of his children. Their attorney tried to paint me as a disgruntled family member seeking money I hadn't earned, someone who had signed legal documents without bothering to read them, and now wanted to escape the consequences of her own carelessness. But his arguments felt hollow against the weight of evidence Patricia had assembled. Marcus took the stand and testified that I had been fully informed about the documents, that the signing had been straightforward and transparent. His voice was steady, his demeanor confident, but I could see something flickering behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of defensive uncertainty that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with his own version of events. Sarah chose not to testify, which spoke volumes about her level of commitment to their story. Mom gave a brief statement about wanting to keep the family together, about how she had hoped to avoid exactly this kind of conflict. She painted herself as a peacemaker, caught between warring children, conveniently omitting her role in orchestrating the entire situation. The judge listened to everything with the patience of someone accustomed to human drama, in all its messy, complicated forms. When the testimony concluded, she announced that she would review the evidence and issue her ruling within 2 weeks. Those 14 days stretched like an eternity. I went through the motions of my normal life, teaching my classes, grocery, shopping, paying bills, but everything felt suspended, as if I were holding my breath underwater waiting to surface. Patricia called on a Tuesday morning while I was grading papers at the kitchen table of my small apartment. Her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear something underneath it that made my heart race. "The judge has issued her ruling," she said. "The document is null and void. Your share of the property has been reinstated." I sat in stunned silence, the red pen in my hand forgotten as her words sank in. Null and void. invalid. The legal equivalent of saying it had never existed at all, that the betrayal that had shattered my family and sent me into exile had been built on nothing more substantial than fraudulent paperwork and manufactured authority. "Emma?" Patricia's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you there?" "I'm here," I managed, though I felt like I was floating somewhere above my body, watching this conversation happen to someone else. What happens now? The practical details were complex. Paperwork to be filed, property records to be updated, notifications to be sent to all parties involved. But the emotional reality was simpler and more profound. I had been vindicated. The court had looked at the evidence and determined that what had been done to me was wrong, legally and morally. I didn't call them after the ruling. There was no satisfaction in imagining their reactions, no desire to gloat or demand apologies. The victory felt quiet and internal, like a deep breath I had been holding for months finally being released. Instead, I walked to the small park near my apartment and sat on a bench beside a pond where ducks paddled in lazy circles. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and leaves drifted down from the oak trees like nature's confetti, celebrating small, private triumphs. I thought about Dad, about whether he would be proud of me for fighting, or disappointed that it had come to this. I decided he would be proud. He had raised me to believe in fairness, in standing up for myself, in the importance of truth, even when it was inconvenient or uncomfortable. A week later, I received an email from Marcus. The subject line was simply, "Discussion," and the message was brief and carefully worded, clearly composed with the advice of their attorney. He asked if we could discuss the recent court ruling and find a way forward that works for everyone. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a pragmatic suggestion that we negotiate a settlement that would avoid further legal complications. I stared at the email for a long time, my cursor hovering over the reply button. There was a part of me that wanted to write back, to engage in whatever conversation he was proposing, to try once more to salvage something from the wreckage of our family relationships. But I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, though I had been. Not because I wanted to punish them, though they deserved it. I didn't reply because I had learned something important during those months of silence and exile. Some relationships aren't worth salvaging. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive. And sometimes the healthiest response to toxicity is simply to walk away. I never heard from Sarah or Mom. Whether they were embarrassed by the court ruling, angry about the legal fees, or simply indifferent to my existence, I would never know. Their silence, which had once felt like punishment, now felt like freedom. I kept the summer house, though I never went back to it. Instead, I sold my share to a young family from the city who promised to fill it with children's laughter and birthday parties, and all the ordinary magic that makes a house into a home. The money allowed me to make a down payment on a small house of my own, nothing fancy but with good bones, and a garden where I could plant whatever I wanted. I returned to teaching full-time, this time at an elementary school where my principal valued my experience with adult learners and gave me freedom to develop innovative programs. I started a book club for teachers, began volunteering at the animal shelter on weekends, slowly built a community of chosen family who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide them. Sometimes, late at night, I would think about the path that had led me here. From that August afternoon when I signed papers, I didn't understand to this quiet life I had built from nothing but determination and self-respect. The journey had been painful, but it had also been necessary. It had taught me that family is something you choose as much as something you're born into, that love without respect is worthless, and that sometimes justice comes not with thunder and lightning, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing you refuse to let yourself be erased. I learned that you don't have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm, that loyalty is a two-way street, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away from people who don't know how to love you back. The court documents are filed away in a folder in my desk drawer now, rarely looked at, but never forgotten. They represent more than a legal victory. They are proof that I refuse to disappear, refuse to accept a version of myself that others had tried to impose upon me. On quiet Sunday mornings, I sit in my garden with coffee and the newspaper, listening to my neighbors' children playing in their yards, feeling grateful for this life I never planned but somehow found. The pain of losing my family of origin has faded to a manageable ache, replaced by the deeper satisfaction of knowing I fought for myself when no one else would. Sometimes justice isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it comes wrapped in court transcripts and sealed envelopes, delivered by tired attorneys who believe in fairness even when it's not profitable. And sometimes, silence isn't exile. It's the sound of dignity being reclaimed, one quiet breath at a time. They erased me from their story, but they couldn't erase my story from the world.